Rhode Island. And of course, as we do every Tuesday, as I step to the side here and give a nice welcome to Jennifer Lawless down at American University, the director of the Women in Politics Institute down there. Wanted to kick off, actually, you've got kind of a big talk down there tonight. It was featured prominently in the Washingtonian as top things to do this week, talking about women in politics. So tell us a little bit about your talk this evening down there.
Well, first I should note it's a slow news week. So tonight I'll be talking about what happens when women run for office, why they don't run, and why it's so important that they do. And that's been getting a lot of attention this week, in fact, because Mitch McConnell put together a working group in the Senate to craft the Senate's version of the health care bill, and it's comprised of 13 white men. So women's absence from the highest ranks of political power has gotten renewed attention, which it does every time we see a photo op that highlights just how male-dominated our political institutions are.
Fantastic. And tell us, where is it taking place? If anyone's watching down in D.C. might want to go. What are the details for this evening?
The doors open at 6:30, and it's at 7 o'clock at the 6th and I Synagogue, so right on 6th and I.
Aptly named. Well, wish you well with that. I'm sure you're getting busy prepping for that. You know, as we joked before, school might be out, but the work doesn't stop, especially right now for a political scientist. So many things to talk about this past week happening down in D.C., but the one that seems to obviously have gotten the most attention and most recently with Sally Yates and her testimony before Congress. Talk to us a little bit about that, what you see as being sort of the fallout, if you will, with what we've heard from Yates. Now, this is the former acting attorney general, information that she knew about Michael Flynn, who she told and when, and what the Trump administration did with it. Provided that testimony there yesterday. Obviously, folks talking a lot about it. What can we expect now to come?
Well, it's unclear that anything will necessarily come of it if really there's no evidence that Donald Trump knew anything more than what Michael Flynn knew, or that he knew it far longer before he actually did anything about it. But I think substantively, the piece of information that's key is that Sally Yates had been very clear with the administration in saying that they should be concerned and that there could be compromises that are being made because of Michael Flynn's relationships. And it took the Trump administration 18 days to move and to work on that. The political fallout, more than the substantive fallout, highlights how some of the Republican members of the Senate were trying to back up the administration and were basically shot down by Yates. In particular, the two senators from Texas, Cornyn and Ted Cruz, who ran for president, were made to basically look like mush. They tried to out-lawyer her, and she ultimately won because they were trying to actually raise issues about the travel ban when that wasn't why she was there to testify in the first place.
It might be difficult to sort of out-lawyer an attorney general, I would imagine.
I think that's right.
not being a lawyer myself. Well, as I mentioned to you when we were talking prior to the show today, so much going on the investigation side of things. And I said, is this unique to Trump? I mean, we saw a little bit under the Obama administration with Benghazi. Of course, we saw under Clinton. But here we have a president, barely into office, and it just seems to be sort of an investigatory industrial complex. What's your take on sort of the politics on one side and then obviously the continued investigations and any number of fronts on the other?
Well, this is a little bit different than anything we've ever seen before for a couple of reasons. The first is that the Trump administration, and Donald Trump in particular, have really brought it on entirely on their own. So the kinds of things that he's done, the kinds of things that he's said, the wiretapping allegations, for example, were not things that any previous president would ever allege. And so the investigations that tend to come out of other administrations have to do with policies that have been enacted or outcomes that might not have gone the way that the Congress wanted them to go. The closest we've gotten to anything like this, I think, is the Clinton administration, where there was Whitewater, and there was Filegate, and there was Travelgate, and ultimately there was Monica Lewinsky. But again, that was because the Republicans wanted to make sure that Bill Clinton was not allowed to succeed in anything he wanted to do. Here, this isn't the Democrats trying to keep Trump from actually doing anything. It's both Democrats and Republicans trying to figure out if there are any legs to the many, many stories that the administration is actually putting out there.
And as you mentioned, you said, not being sure what happens moving forward with Yates' testimony about what happened with Flynn. How does this play out as, the Trump administration is trying to oversee sort of what's happening in Congress, or move to healthcare in a little bit. How much of a distraction are all of these investigations, especially in the news cycle? There's almost as much, if not more, attention it seems to be paid by national media on things on the investigatory side of things. Clearly plenty, obviously, on policy, but they seem to be competing for oxygen.
Well, I think in some ways that's what makes it a positive news day for the Trump administration, to the extent that he can make it seem like the media are just fishing and trying to find things to investigate. That's one day that he doesn't have to talk about the healthcare debacle. It's one day that he doesn't have to talk about the fact that his tax reform bill is going nowhere. It's one day that he doesn't have to talk about what he's going to do for the stimulus, right? It's another day where he's able to continue to play this narrative that the media hate him and they're basically on a fishing expedition and they're willing to catch anything that can come up. For the Democrats, it's also good news, though, because it highlights that they are in a position where they don't actually have to do anything. The Trump administration looks like it's taking itself down, and that's going to be helpful for them in 2018.
What do you think? I don't know. Did you catch SNL this weekend and the discussions of where in the world is Kellyanne Conway? She came out and made some statements this week. What is her role, do you see? I mean, she kind of comes and goes. Is that in itself sort of a distraction? Obviously doesn't have the major role that she once had.
Well, it's unclear that she doesn't have the major role that she once had. We know that she doesn't have the spokesperson role that she once had, because that probably was a distraction. And it was getting to the point where what she said or how she was going to say it was what was making news. And we know that Donald Trump doesn't like anybody to steal his thunder. But I don't know that there's anything to suggest that she's not still playing a major role as the senior counsel to the president. Every time she comes out of the woodwork, though, obviously that winds up becoming newsworthy, and anything that she says or how she says it also garners attention. But to be perfectly honest, I mean, since she sort of stepped out of that, Sean Spicer has had no problem filling the airtime and the space. And so, I don't know that there's really a downside to Kellyanne Conway at this point.
Okay, talking about the investigatory side of things, one of the topics that you had suggested we speak about, Huma's emails to her husband there, and how that played a role in the election. What's your take on that?
Well, I mean, it's now clear that Comey lied, right? And he said that Huma Abedin had forwarded, I think, hundreds of thousands of emails to Anthony Weiner, classified emails, and that was part of the investigation. That was part of the impetus behind and the catalyst for Comey's letter 11 days before the election. And if that even affected voter turnout by half a percentage point in Wisconsin or Michigan or Philadelphia, not even in broader Pennsylvania, but just in that city, that could have ultimately cost Hillary Clinton the election. So the more and more that we're hearing, the more and more it looks like bad choices, lies, and deception probably did play a role. We'll never know for sure whether it actually affected the outcome, because we don't know what people would have done. We can only speculate. But there's no question that there were a lot of forces, both nefarious and probably more or less just dumb decisions that ultimately, mattered to voters the 30 days leading up to the election.
No, you said obviously it can't change the fact of what happened in the outcome of the election. Do you see it as potentially playing into a voter, turnout for the midterms? Does this sway anybody who might have been on the fence, who might have been, voted for Trump and not voted for Clinton? Do you think that there's that political consultants are trying to identify if there's a demographic there that might now sort of be up for grabs now that this information has been revealed?
Well, I don't know that it's a demographic that's up for grabs, but I do think that what this can do for the Democrats is help them identify people who might not have turned out to vote because they were turned off, and communicate to them the importance of every single vote and how no outcome is a foregone conclusion. The other thing that it helps the Democrats with is crafting this broader narrative about how there were all sorts of forces at stake and at play that ultimately undermined the election, and Democrats can't let that happen again. So it's the kind of push that I think the Democrats might need to take back the House. Now, again, it's possible. The math is not something that they can't conquer, but it would mean that they really have to have an almost perfect election cycle. So these kinds of factors are helpful, but they're by no means a guarantee.
What do you have to say when Republicans make the argument that this information that was leaked was information said and stated by people to begin with who thought it was private and ended up being public? But again, if there was interference by an outside body, there are the naysayers that say, well, they said it, they wrote it, it just happened to come to light. Or is it just an indictment on sort of where we're at in democracy?
I think it's probably some of both. I think it's an indictment of where we're at, but I also think that it's sort of easier to swallow if it affected both sides equally, and we kind of knew what was going on behind closed doors in both campaigns, and then voters made decisions accordingly. But we've learned over the course of the last few weeks that Comey and the FBI were also investigating Donald Trump and alleged ties to Russia, and that was not a letter that he wound up sending, that was not information that was brought forward to the American people, despite the fact, from my understanding, that the DNC was actually trying to push that and make that something that voters cared about. And so, I think there's something to be said about these outside forces playing a role. There's something to be said about the American people deserving information, and if you put it in print, or if you put it in email, or if you forward it, then it's fair game. But there's also something to be said about equality of information dissemination, and I think we're learning as time goes on that that's where there really seems to have been a disconnect. And the Trump administration, when it was the Trump campaign, just wasn't held to the same standard as Hillary Clinton was.
Now, I know your focus is pretty much primarily American politics, but maybe a little shift to France for a second here. There was talk about the days leading up to the election about attempted interference by outside forces, clearly not successful in that sense there. Too much of apples and oranges to compare the two. Obviously we don't know the size or scope there, but it looked like there had been a concerted effort to affect the outcome there, again, in Le Pen's favor.
Right. So I think that it is probably apples to oranges, but the fact that it didn't matter or didn't work, to me at least, communicates this general premise now that moving forward, I think all campaigns and all administrations who are in charge of making sure that elections are carried out in a fair way are going to be very cognizant of the potential for outside interference in a way that, 4 years ago, 8 years ago, even 2 years ago in the midterms, we just weren't concerned about.
Do you think, are we going to see a return to pencil and paper with all of the leaks going on? There's always the maxim of don't say in an elevator that which you wouldn't want seen splashed on the front page of a newspaper. But with, everything, people having to be so cognizant of, oh my gosh, what if this gets leaked? How do you see that as impacting, especially internal organizations? Happens anywhere, not necessarily politics, but again, is it really that sort of don't put in an email that which you wouldn't want leaked to Russian hackers?
Yes, I think that basically is it. The same way that we say don't post on Facebook or on social media something that you don't want your parents to see, right? Like no matter how old you are, if you don't want them to see it, just don't post it. I think that there will be ultimately a way where we get to the point where there are more secured emails, or there are more secured servers, or we understand sort of exactly how this hacking takes place and ways to ward against it. But in the short run, my sense is that yes, the same way that you don't say something that you don't want to be on the record, you don't put something in writing that you don't want to be on the record.
That is true. So we spent a lot of time focusing on Yates, talking a little bit about Comey, but of course the sort of looming issue at large down in D.C. is healthcare now moving to the Senate after the passage in the House. And you just talked about Mitch McConnell convening the group of all white men to vet this. What do we have a sense of time frame, and what do we have a sense of what are we expecting in the coming weeks here?
So my sense is that it's going to be a months-long process, not a weeks-long process. Several senators have said that the main way that they're different from the House is they actually deliberate. I've also heard people like Susan Collins and Bill Cassidy, who are working on an alternative, pushing the Senate to basically start from scratch. And so this is not the chamber where Donald Trump is able to just hand Mitch McConnell his version of a bill and say, please vote on this by Friday. The upside is that the Democrats are going to have more of an incentive not only to intervene and to play a role and to try to shape the legislation, but also to try and figure out whether there are things that they're willing to work on in order to save some of the pieces of Obamacare that they care most about. In the House, the bill was so far beyond anything that any Democrat would okay that there was really no incentive to engage in any kind of compromise or any kind of working together.
Is addressing the issue of pre-existing conditions and coverage for pre-existing conditions, is that really at the heart of it? And do we expect to see something different on the Senate side? Because that seems to be the third rail.
Well, I mean, it's a little bit more complicated than that because basically what the House version does is allow the states to apply for waivers, not so that they can not treat people who have pre-existing conditions, but so that they can offer alternative types of policies or higher premiums for people who do. And so that's the way that both Donald Trump and the House Republicans are able to say, oh my gosh, we're still keeping everything the same. But they're actually not. I think the Senate is going to have to do a much better job because now the American people have been primed to realize that, oh, it's not exactly what you say it is. The other thing that the Senate has to deal with is a newly vocal Barack Obama advocating for maintaining all of the key components of Obamacare. When the House was dealing with both the first and second versions of the health care bill, Barack Obama was not back in the limelight, and now the Senate's going to have to contend with him.
Did you expect this? Did you expect President Obama to sort of wade back in the policy waters to really sort of voice his opinion on what's going on?
I thought it would probably take a little bit longer, although I think it is kind of unbelievable that it's been only a little bit more than 100 days, and basically in every realm of policy, everything is up for grabs. And so he probably sees this as an opportunity. Also, it's unclear who the leader of the Democratic Party is right now, and so the fact that he sort of steps in to be that mouthpiece makes a lot of sense.
Well, great, Jennifer. Always appreciate picking your brain. Anything else before you go off to your big talk this evening?
No, I would just say continue to watch over the course of the next few weeks because the differences between the House and the Senate, I think, not only on healthcare but more broadly, are going to become quite obvious. And I think it's true that the House is far more likely to just be a rubber stamp for Trump. And if he's been frustrated with the way that they've been behaving, he hasn't seen anything yet.
Okay, Jennifer Lawless down at American University. As always, appreciate your Skype.